Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Next keynote is going to be given by Huriya Jabbar and it's titled Markets and Inequality, Exploring Mechanisms of Choice and Competition in Schools. As many of you already know, Huriya Jabbar is an associate professor in Education Policy and Planning Program in the Department of Education Leadership and Policy at the University of Texas at Austin. And her research uses sociological and critical theories to examine how market-based ideas in K-12 and higher education shape inequality, opportunity, and democracy in the US. Currently, she is studying school choice policy and school leaders' behavioral responses to competitions, choice, and decision-making in higher education. Also, the teacher job choices, recruitment, and retention. Her work has been extensively published for instance, in journals such as American Educational Research, Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, Harvard Educational Review, Educational Administration Quarterly, Educational Researcher, and Sociology of Education. Also, in addition, she has received the Early Career Award for Excellence in Education in 2021 from the American Educational Research Association and the Divisional Policy and Politics Early Career Award in 2020. In 2013, she was recipient of the National Academy of Education Spencer Dissertation Fellowship and in 2016, a Spencer Postdoctoral Fellow, which supported a study exploring teachers' job research processes and the role of social networks in three charter-dense cities, New Orleans, Denver, and San Antonio. She is affiliated with the National Center for Research on Education, Access and Choice and the Education Research Alliance from New Orleans and Tulane University, where she continues to study issues related to school choice in New Orleans and also is a faculty teacher affiliated at the Population Research Center at the UT. Finally, Huriya received a BA in Economics from the University of California at Santa Cruz, in Economics from the New School for Social Research, and a PhD in Education Policy, Organization, Measurement, and Evaluation from the University of California, Berkeley. So with all these impressive credentials, we are really looking forward to your keynote, Huriya. Friendly reminder, we emphasize that we have about 45-50 minutes to give enough room for the questions and answers that I'm sure are going to be also very interesting. Without further delay, the floor is yours, Huriya.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Just have a few points to share, but thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to share some of the work that my collaborators and I have been doing on school choice and competition across schools in the US. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but looking forward to the conversation afterwards and hope to connect at future conferences and convenings or just by Zoom. So today I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about market-like mechanisms or what people also call incentivist or market-based reforms or quasi-markets in education. This is what my research over the past decade or so has focused on. And I'll focus on the implications of these market-based reforms for equity and access in education. And I'll do that by sharing examples of my work in this area, but also some work that our team has been doing as part of a research center. It's a new research center that's focused on school choice and equity. And my goal is really to argue that we need multiple and cross-disciplinary lenses to understand the broader impact of market-based reforms in education. And so I'll start with why I study school choice policy and how I came to this line of work, the questions and the curiosities that I think might be very similar to yours. And then I'll give an overview of the key findings from my work on choice and competition first, and then work on teachers' experiences in settings with school choice. And then I'll wrap up by just talking a little bit about kind of where I think the field needs to go next, and share some of the work that we're doing at this research center. And then I'm looking forward to your questions and comments and discussion after that. I had a chance to look through some of the papers and I just see a lot of alignment and resonance. So excited to have that conversation. So how did I come to do research on school choice policy? I've really been interested broadly in how markets or market-based ideas play out in public settings, and in particular, the tensions between public and private forms of governance in schools. And I came to realize that the economics of education and public services is very different from the economics of private firms and businesses in important ways. That, of course, as you all know, unlike the private sector, suppliers and demanders of educational services often don't sort themselves based on price signals. And there are broader purposes of education, of course, beyond maximizing profits or efficiency. And so most of my work has focused on looking at privatization and school choice policies that shift power to individual schools. And I focused especially on charter schools in the US, which are run by private operators. And the goal is also, of course, to shift power to individual parents as consumers of educational services. And of course, marketization and privatization are separate constructs, but in the US policy context, they often overlap. And so I guess I think I've also just generally been concerned and had a curiosity about how wealth and opportunity are distributed, and then what the proper role or responsibility of government was in addressing those inequalities. And so I think I came to this work initially with a curiosity about why advocates argue that markets could improve equity in education when we see that markets and capitalism generally create such widening inequalities in wealth and income in our society more broadly. And so I'll talk today about the work that I've done on school choice policy, which is an area where we see a lot of market-based ideas in the public sector. And just to kind of orient ourselves to the school choice policies I'll talk about, these include things like private school vouchers, charter schools, and open enrollment policies. And these policies have existed for decades throughout the world, of course. But there's been significant expansion in the US since the early 2000s under federal incentives, private sector encouragement, and advocacy group involvement in local, state, and federal policy. And so this graph here shows the growth in charter schools from 2000 to 2015, for example. And this debate over whether to implement school choice policy was really fierce when I was in graduate school. And so I think this just seemed like a natural topic for someone like me who was interested in markets and education to focus on. And it's an idea that just does not seem to quit. Every time I think the policy world has maybe moved on from choice, it doesn't. So in 2016, there seemed to be this emerging consensus that choice, at least on its own, was not a solution to educational inequality, that its impacts on marginalized communities especially depended so much on context and policy design. And then we had the appointment of Betsy DeVos as education secretary, who was a fierce advocate for expanding school choice in all of its forms. And that kind of brought these school choice debates back into the limelight, even though researchers had kind of moved on to more nuanced questions about school choice policy. And then in 2020, when I was lucky enough to receive tenure and started to think about, what future directions could my work go in, perhaps moving away from these controversial school choice topics towards, other key policy levers. COVID and the recent movements for racial justice have really brought choice back into the forefront. And we're seeing choice now emerge in both similar and in new ways. So first, the pandemic brought more attention to homeschooling, which had always existed, but especially in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot more attention to educating children at home. And we also saw this expansion of the idea of choice to include the modality of instruction and giving families, for example, the option of in-person or virtual or hybrid learning. And now we're seeing this new wave of school voucher bills across many states in the US, partly in response to the teaching about race and racism in schools. And charter schools, which we're starting to see prior to the pandemic, a kind of flattening in enrollment, have now seen increases in many states as well. And so these are just some of the many forms of choice policy that we've seen kind of grow in the last couple of years. And so I keep coming back to this work on school choice I think the idea of school choice is so powerful and remains with us because it captures these essential tensions in our conception of public education as a public or a private good, right? One that benefits individuals under this kind of consumer model, or one that benefits society and democracy, providing equal access and redistributing opportunities. And school choice is also thorny because it brings up tensions about who is responsible for ensuring a high quality education for children, and whether that burden is placed on parents and families in a more privatized model or on the state in a public system. And that also brings up questions then about the appropriate role and form of governance in public schools. And so with these kind of tensions in mind, I want to talk about when and under what conditions school choice policies, especially I'll focus on charter school policies, can reproduce or exacerbate inequalities in education by sharing some of my work on this topic. So I'm going to focus primarily on this idea of competition and choice for a few reasons. One is, it's a really prominent idea or concept in policy debates. School choice has been enacted for a number of reasons in the US, but according to our state charter laws, the most common rationale for charter schools is that school choice will improve educational quality through this mechanism of competition. The idea is that choice will create healthy competition between schools, and as schools lose students because of choice, they'll be compelled to improve their educational programs to attract and retain students. And the way it works is that parents, as rational actors, if given choice, will vote with their feet and leave low-performing schools for better ones, and this in turn puts pressure on those low-performing schools to improve. And the incentive works through per-pupil funding, which is tied to every student enrolled. And school leaders are expected to respond to this enrollment loss or the threat of enrollment loss by improving their educational product, their academic and curricular programs, or at least the efficiency of their operations. And if they don't, schools that are under-enrolled or underperforming are shut down. And it's important to note that this is an important part of the theory of choice because it argues that all students can benefit from choice, even those that don't actively choose and might remain in their neighborhood or default schools. And so as some economists have argued, school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And this is so critical to the argument for choice because it means there are widespread benefits beyond just the select families who choose. The idea that there are these systemic impacts. And so a lot of my work on school choice and charter schools has focused on this assumption of competition, this key assumption that underlies so many of our choice policies. And I came to the work with some critiques and concerns about this kind of taken for granted idea. And I wondered what empirical work said about what we actually know about how competition works in schools. And so these are some of the questions that I've explored. At the broadest level, I'm interested in how market-based ideas in education influence opportunity, inequality, and democracy in the US. And specifically, I've been interested in how and with whom school leaders perceive competition, what strategies they use to respond to competitive pressure, and then how school regulatory environments, so the policies, laws, and rules, how those shape the nature of market actions, including school leaders' perceptions and responses to competitive pressure. And then finally, more recently, I've been interested in how teachers find and select jobs in settings with high concentrations of charter schools. So this last question really gets at competition for teachers in these types of settings. And so I'll talk about the work in each of these areas, and I'll wrap up with some of the new directions our team is going in, and also where I hope the field will go. And so with the work on competition, I've approached this in different ways. But one way is to just understand what the existing research says about competition. And in general, the research has been pretty mixed on whether competition improves student outcomes. And to make sense of these conflicting reports, I worked with my collaborator called Carlton Fong and several of our grad students to do a systematic review and meta-analysis of these competitive effects. And we found that on the whole, the effects of competition on student achievement were very small and on average positive. And we think that the fact that these effects are small and positive could ease critics' concerns that competition will significantly hurt those students who are left behind due to choice policies, at least in terms of achievement. At the same time, though, we think the results are very small, too small really to have a major impact on educational equality or inequality on their own. And so this isn't really a rising tide lifts all boats type of situation. And of course, we need to look at long-term effects of competition, whether it makes schools more efficient, whether it increases segregation, these other outcomes, whether it leads schools to focus more on test prep. We just don't know a lot about these other outcomes. But this is what we know from the quantitative literature, this large body of work on if competition improves outcomes, but we don't know, we know less about how competition works to impact outcomes and efficiency in schools. So there are a lot of assumptions embedded here, right? So to generate this positive strategic response to competition, school leaders must perceive competition and develop appropriate and productive strategies to compete. For example, they must improve academic programs or instruction rather than just selecting students or just marketing and advertising their schools. And so I've been curious about how these traditional, often rooted in economics assumptions about how teachers and leaders will behave in these market-based settings. And I've tried to merge that with other theories and constructs from social science, so drawing on sociological or political or psychological aspects to just better understand these mechanisms of competition. So how do teachers and leaders actually make decisions and respond to market pressures, and how do those actions then influence educational inequity? And so the goal is really to unpack the black box of competition. And so one of the first key questions in this area focused on how and with whom do school leaders perceive competition, and what strategies do they use to respond to competitive pressures? And so to understand these mechanisms of competition, conceptually, I've drawn on multiple lenses. So I use theoretical tools from sociology, especially the way that sociologists look at markets. They argue that economic worlds are social worlds, and that markets should be studied using the tools of sociology. And so in particular, I've examined how perceptions of the competitive arena can shape schools' strategies. And I studied this competitive arena as a social network of competitors, what other scholars have referred to as cognitive communities or circuits of competitors. And this really emphasizes the social nature of competition that might consist of schools, monitoring other schools' behavior rather than responding directly to consumers or parents. And also emphasizes how social norms and networks can moderate how school leaders respond to competitive pressures. And at the time I started this work, there was just very limited research on this kind of approach to studying competition in schools in the US. And so I drew primarily on research that was done in other contexts, especially in the UK, where these circuits or networks of competitors had been studied using these more contextualized and localized approaches. And then I also draw on the field of critical policy analysis and policy implementation literature to sort of complement this approach. I just think we need these multiple lenses to really understand the social as well as the economic nature of competition and how it's shaped by networks and by context. And so this figure that is looking very small on my screen, so I hope you can see it, it captures how I think about this nature of competition. And my work really takes up each of the dimensions here on the left side. So first, how school leaders perceive competitive pressure, and then how those perceptions shape their strategies in response to competition, which of course has implications for outcomes. And so in the first kind of set of studies I conducted was in New Orleans, where currently all students attend charter schools. And I combined in-depth interviews with surveys of principals there and social network analysis to examine the nature of competition. And so I wanted to give a little bit of context about New Orleans. New Orleans is a small city in the state of Louisiana. And in public schools, Black students are overrepresented, comprising 83% of the student body. White students make up 8%, and this does not mirror the city's population. And nowhere, I think, is the experiment in market-driven reforms more extreme than in New Orleans, where Hurricane Katrina and the resulting flooding put 80% of the schools underwater. And soon after, the city's school system was completely changed. New Orleans is one of the most unequal cities in the US. And Katrina and it really exposed, I think, many Americans to the race and class inequities in the city. Louisiana is also one of the the poorest states in the US and has the second lowest educational attainment for African Americans in the country. It also imprisons more of its population than any other state in the US. And so I think, Katrina really exposed people nationwide to this reality within the US. And there were articles written about, is this America? Because people could not really believe that such conditions could be tolerated in a US city. And in the chaos after the hurricane and the flooding, state policymakers completely rebuilt the city school system. It was one that was struggling before the storm, and it is now almost, now it is all charter schools. At the time of the work, it was, I think, 90-something% charter schools. And, some native New Orleanians have, someone bitterly told me that, people were still searching for their relatives and family members when key education reformers really seized the opportunity to rebuild the city schools in this way. And so the changes post-Katrina to the school system have led to really dramatic changes. As I mentioned, it's all charter schools now, and also to the teaching workforce. It also resulted in a huge drop in the percentage of Black teachers in the city. And then these alternative teacher programs like Teach for America and the New Teacher Project both have a strong presence there as well. And so, beginning with school leaders' perceptions, I was really curious about how leaders identify competitors and what the networks or clusters of competitors are in New Orleans, and then what factors really predict these competitive ties between schools. Are they correlated with student flows between schools or with the geographic measures that have been used in the literature? Do other factors like school leaders' characteristics or school performance matter? And in my research, I found that school leaders in these charter-heavy contexts do report high levels of competitive pressure. And I found that where a school sits in the market hierarchy, which is shaped by history and politics and local contexts, as well as who leaders viewed as rivals, really shaped the possible and actual strategic actions that school leaders took in response to market pressure, with significant implications for equitable access to choice. For example, things like a charter school brand name mattered in predicting competition, even after controlling for things like school performance or proximity. And so did gender. So female principals were less likely to report competition overall. And then I was curious about how school leaders then behaved in this competitive environment. So what actions do principals identify as engaging competitive behavior? Is it marketing? Is it improving instruction? And my work and other qualitative research in this area too has found that evidence that schools are not primarily responding to competitive pressure by improving academics, but instead they more often engage in marketing, which is of course, superficial and not a substantive change to school quality or offerings. And at times they engage in strategies that could really exacerbate inequities or segregation in schools, like cream skimming or selecting or excluding students who they viewed as less desirable or who might harm their test scores, even when that was in direct violation of policy. And so this is a case where the combination of market and accountability pressures can lead school actors to behave in ways that create these kind of barriers to access. The research, of course, is still inconclusive in terms of how systematic these behaviors are, in part because it's really hard to document these behaviors and also to disentangle them from parent preferences that can also drive segregation. But these are some of the potential mechanisms at play in these choice contexts that can lead to segregated schools and unequal access through these barriers to enrollment. And then later, I examined these same patterns in Arizona as well with my collaborator, Ben Creed, again through surveys and qualitative interviews. And that work actually helped me to further situate school leaders' actions within their contexts. We found that in our work in Arizona that marketing strategies were not really related to school leaders' perceptions of competitive pressures. It seemed that advertising was really just part and parcel of charter school practices. And in our qualitative work, we found that marketing was seen as a legitimate activity by charter principals because it didn't require that leaders manipulate the technical core of education, of teaching and learning in order to be competitive. But of course, as the literature has shown, the heavy reliance on marketing and especially targeted marketing practices can exacerbate or maintain segregation by conveying subtle messages about who belongs in a particular school or who would be a good fit. And so overall, this work really showed that education markets are tiered, they're hierarchical, they're also deeply shaped by history and by context. And as I was trying to make sense of what I saw in this fieldwork in New Orleans, how principals' actions in these contexts responded to competition in ways that we can argue were ultimately inequitable and unethical, despite leaders' commitments to serving marginalized students, I realized that there were these more macro forces that were shaping the incentive structures and shaping the environments that principals were trying to navigate. And so this really led me to this next question about how schools' regulatory environments and policies and laws and rules influence the nature of market actions. And so here I really wanted to understand how economic worlds are also political worlds, and how markets and education especially are shaped by local government institutions, which set the rules of the game. They open and close and otherwise oversee schools. And this is really underexamined in the US context, especially in the economics of education literature, but also more broadly in education policy research on choice. Contrary to advocates' claims, school choice reforms have not limited the involvement of local government, but have instead redefined its role as one that is increasingly regulatory, guiding and supporting markets through oversight and information, rather than directly providing services. And so I wanted to understand how exactly do different regulatory environments influence the ways in which school choice reforms play out. And so I compared schools under two different governance systems in New Orleans, the traditional public school board, which is a traditional school district, and the recovery school district, which was established just prior to Katrina and took over quote unquote failing schools, and later ended up taking over the vast majority of public schools in New Orleans and converting them into charters. And so I drew on over 100 interviews with school, district, and state leaders. And I found that these two governing agencies had really different historical trajectories and philosophies about the appropriate role of oversight and privatization, which shaped their policies and regulations. So the traditional school district had a more pragmatic or case-by-case approach to privatization, with the idea that, quote, you have to guide it. You can't expect market forces to generate equitable and efficient outcomes on their own. On the other hand, the recovery school district took a more systematic approach, really seeking to reshape the role of local districts or government, claiming that they were, quote, not in the business of running schools. And these districts and governing agencies played a key role in the education marketplace. They oversaw the functioning of the choice market, measuring quality and performance, providing information about school options, opening and closing schools, and influencing the potential for economies of scale in school operations, as well as addressing the unequal effects of market-based reforms. And these policies also influence the type and extent of competition between schools, and they significantly constrained or enabled school leaders' abilities to respond to market pressures, sometimes mitigating and other times exacerbating inequities in the educational marketplace by, for example, overseeing enrollment systems. And in general, the city moved from what people at the time called the Wild West, a system of free choice with very little restrictions or regulations, but one that was ripe with inequities, to one that increasingly developed rules and regulations to address market failures or problems. And so in this work, I argue that especially in education, unfettered markets are unfair markets, that we need strong systems of oversight to prevent choice from deepening existing educational inequity. And I'll come back to this at the end when I point to some of the important questions that I'm hoping that we can ask as a field around these issues. And so I just want to touch on this third question here. As I was studying how school leaders competed for students and enrollment, this third question really emerged from that work. And it started really with just one offhand comment by a principal I was interviewing, excuse me. And what I heard from this school leader was, yes, we are competing for students, but we're also competing for teachers. And that's what really sparked my interest in this topic. The idea being that that school choice changes the set of schooling options, not just for students and families, but also for teachers. It's potentially harder for teachers to navigate the new landscape of schools. But of course, there's also theoretically more flexibility in recruitment and retention strategies, and more types of organizations for teachers to work in. And so this next set of studies really focused on teachers' experiences in settings with expansive school choice policies. And I looked across three sites, New Orleans again, but also looked at Detroit and San Antonio, which are cities that have very high but varying charter school market share. And we ultimately interviewed about 200 teachers across these sites who had, including several that had recently switched positions or were actually searching for a position, and followed them through their job search. And this was in collaboration with Marissa Kanata and two now former graduate students, Emily Germain and Andreen Castro. And so in particular, we're really curious about the role of social networks in teacher hiring in these contexts where hiring is decentralized and privatized. And what we found was that the extent of charter concentration and the associated fragmentation or decentralization in a school district seemed to drive the use of networks, with networks becoming more important for job searches in settings where information on job openings was less centralized. We also found that its reliance on social networks in the job search came with drawbacks, that these tight networks did limit opportunities for teachers of color and to some extent women. I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. And so we found that teachers use their networks to find and land jobs. Some teachers actually never engaged in a formal job search, but were just lured to an opportunity by a friend or a former colleague. And respondents said things like, it's who you know, you can apply for a job, but the real way is networking. And so teachers were aware that leveraging networks was important. And we found that teachers use their networks in different ways, both for information and for influence. Teachers use their networks to access hiring managers. And this was more common in Detroit and New Orleans, which had a much higher charter school market share, and to a lesser extent in San Antonio, which was the more traditional of our districts. And for some teachers, they didn't only get a leg up or quote, move to the top of the pile, but in some cases they secured hiring meetings that were, quote, not really interviews, and were able to bypass the interview process altogether. And so there are just many more examples of this in New Orleans and also some in Detroit. And one teacher referred to these positions as, quote, shadow jobs, where you have to know people to get to them. And since our work was primarily qualitative, I just wanted to take a moment to show the kind of variation in these networks by illustrating two individual or ego networks. And many of you are familiar with network analysis, but here the central circle or node is a teacher or the respondent, and the arrows connect the people they went to for advice or information as they reported in a short social network questionnaire they completed during the interview. And so here are two teachers with similar years of experience that were both looking to find a better position in New Orleans. One teacher is white. She's from the Northeast in the US, and that's the teacher here on the left. And she has 12 contacts that she goes to for information or advice, including several working teachers and 2 current school principals. And she received offers from 6 schools at the time of our interview. And here on the right is a Black teacher who is from New Orleans. This teacher had 4 connections that helped her in the job search, but she had no ties to leaders, and most of her connections were friends or fellow teachers. And she described this kind of discrimination in the labor market, where she had to go through a much more arduous and inequitable interview process to be considered for the job. And she didn't receive any job offers at the time of her interview. In prior years she had, but they were just not in places where she wanted to work, and so she stayed at her current school. And she described this dynamic in the hiring process in comparison to her white colleague. She said, I mean, all I can do when I interview is put my best foot forward. I do know that I applied for one position at a charter school and another white fellow applied for it, and she didn't have to go through half the steps. They just kind of offered her the job without her even doing a demo teach or anything like that. They just gave it to her. On the other hand, I think I had to go through like 6 different steps to even do a demo teach. And this quote really echoes our broader findings about how some connections were able to buy additional interview processes, and how that in turn influences those that don't have these types of connections. And of course, there's so many different things that can drive different outcomes, and but we did notice these broader patterns related to race and in some cases gender in terms of how networks shaped teachers' job opportunities in charter-heavy districts. And I'm going to skip ahead just to because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions. The only other thing I wanted to mention about the teacher labor markets in these settings that are very high charter contexts is that We also found that there was this environment of high turnover and uncertainty, as well as the creation of two tracks or segments in the teacher labor market, where many teachers felt trapped in the charter sector, which had longer hours, often lower pay, and less job security. And generally, teachers all sought jobs in just a small handful of schools that had very little turnover, and so there were therefore few vacancies. And in some cases, teachers were kind of always on the market, always looking for another opportunity, unsatisfied with their current position. And these patterns can create instability in school staffing, which we know is harmful for students and disproportionately impacts high poverty schools. And so, this is one of the things that I think we want to attend to in the future is really how does these high rates of turnover that we see in charter schools and in systems that have a lot of charter schools or schools of choice, what are the implications of that? How does that impact the organization? How does that impact learning? So it's just another dimension of the teacher labor market that is important to explore. So we've talked about school choice policy and these constructs of competition and markets in education. And really overall, I think one of the key takeaways is that competition for teachers and students plays out differently based on context, perceptions, networks, stratification, that markets are socially and politically constructed. And so we need to study them with these different lenses. And so I want to talk about three promising directions for the field of education policy research on market-based reforms. And so first, I think we need more research on the governance and regulation of education markets. And I'll talk about some of our work that starts to push in this area, but there's just so much more to be done. And then second, I want to talk about economic imperialism in education policy, both studying that and also how we can move beyond that, which leads to the third area, which is doing the difficult work of creating truly interdisciplinary and multi-method research projects in education policy. So while much of my research cautions against policies that seek to expand these market dynamics in schools, I also spend a lot of time thinking about how to design or redesign choice systems in ways that can increase access and equity for children who are in schools right now. So it's, school choice likely does not inherently generate positive outcomes or massive inequities, as I think we've seen in the research over the past several decades. It's the design and the context of these policies that matter. And as I mentioned before, unfettered markets are unfair markets, but regulation through policy design and redesign can help. And so one of the questions we need to be asking more of is, what types of oversight or regulation do we need to make these systems more equitable? What constraints should we put on parent choice to achieve goals of equity and diversity? And there's still just surprisingly little research on this issue of policy design and differences in policy design and choice context, but it's an area that researchers at this center I'm affiliated with, the National Center for Research on Education Access and Choice, or REACH, are exploring. And our work is really focused on improving access and choice, not just in charter schools, which I've talked about, but also in private voucher accepting schools and in open enrollment or inter-district choice programs, with a focus on marginalized students, especially low-income students, students of color, English learners, and students with disabilities who really bear the brunt of these policies. And our guiding kind of focus in this work is how can we improve policy implementation to make school choice deliver on its promise of raising outcomes and increasing opportunities for disadvantaged students. And this is a very complex diagram, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here. So this is the framework that really guides our work. We're trying to understand how these key elements of policy design, things like information, transportation, planning and oversight, how these can reduce, reproduce, or exacerbate inequality in choice systems. And some of the levers we think that can really impact equity are information. So what information do parents have access to about their choices, in what form, and what's most useful to them? What information do they trust? Transportation. So how do families get to schools of choice? This is so key to any policy that seeks to expand choice or decrease segregation, given the segregated housing patterns in the US. And then enrollment. So this can get very nitty gritty in terms of assigning students to schools, what documentation is required once a student is assigned through a lottery, what administrative burdens are we putting on families at that stage, and of course, what are the preferences if there is a lottery system and any weighting in that lottery. And then planning and oversight, and in particular, the explicit goals and accountability around things like school diversity and desegregation. For example, who decides which schools open, what's their mission or focus? And then this relates also, of course, to school closure decisions. And the last area is teacher supply and distribution. And this is a map of our research sites in the US. We're in the midst of the study. We just wrapped up year 3 of 5. And we focused on these 5 contexts that have very different contexts generally, and then a range of choice policies, including charter schools, virtual schools, private school choice through vouchers, and open enrollment or choice between public schools. And so I just want to share a few of our preliminary takeaways in this work. And we found that, at the state level especially, there are these real challenges around access and demand for school options, especially around information and transportation, which could really help make choice a reality for low-income families. There are also issues with access and supply of school options. There was really a lack of planning for choice options, and issues with funding, and then tensions between local control, local districts, and state actors around whether charter schools should open or what types of choice policies should exist. And these policy designs, I think it's important to note, are also in flux and changing, right? In most contexts where there is school choice, the policies are not static. Policymakers are redesigning them, modifying policies in an ongoing way in order to achieve different aims, one of which can be to reduce inequality, but in other ways it can exacerbate that or benefit already privileged families. And so these are just some of the other things that we're looking at. We're looking at how policy design is shaped by social constructions and stereotypes and broader patterns of systemic racism. So we're looking at how school choice policy varies and how policymakers' perceptions and understandings have shaped that. I think when thinking about policy design, we also need to think about how parents navigate that choice and how choice can create these administrative burdens, especially on already marginalized families. How can districts and schools create more streamlined systems that don't shift the burden and responsibility of finding a quality education onto families? And then recently, I've been thinking a lot about economic imperialism, not just in education, but also in public health with the pandemic and the role of some economists in those debates. And as I've studied the implementation of choice policy, I'm interested also in how these market-based policies come to be, and the answer is oftentimes in economic ideas. And there's been this increasing influence of economists in education policy and research, for better and worse, right? Economists have made significant contributions to the quality of research methods and substantive contributions to the study of things like school finance, education policy, and higher education. But they tend to bias certain kinds of research and reforms over others and can overpower other important approaches like descriptive studies or qualitative studies or critical perspectives. And so much of our education policy and our assumptions come from this economic perspective, including what's valued and prioritized. And the research, the research on research use has shown the impact of incentivist and market-based ideas in policymaking areas. And this is just such important implications in terms of what the goals of our education system should be, who should decide things like the content in schools. We're having these heated debates right now around the quote unquote anti-CRT or critical race theory bills in the US. Is the goal of, what is the purpose of education? Is it to prepare workers for the economy, or are there other goals that we need to reprioritize perhaps? And so my collaborator, Francine Menashe, and I are working together to really deepen our conceptualization of the role of economic ideas in policy. And one of the things that we really think could be further developed is empirical analyses of economic imperialism. So research that explicitly examines the powerful role of economic research or ideas in policy, and how maybe other ideas or disciplines become marginalized in the process of decision-making, especially in areas of school choice and school reform. And then I think, even more importantly, perhaps we can leverage the powerful tools from economics to do more truly interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work, the kind of work that feminists or Marxists or stratification economists do. And this is obviously relevant to many areas of education, but I think especially for understanding how markets operate in education and their implications for equity. And so that's really this last point that, if we want to address these systemic inequities in education and society, we really need interdisciplinary and cross-sector and multi-method work. These are really complex and multi-layered challenges in education. And I'm really encouraged by the new directions within economics to do more research that centers equity, that frames issues with asset-oriented approaches rather than deficit perspectives on the population studied, and is trying to do more truly interdisciplinary work that attends to things like context and place and structural inequalities. I'm also excited by this growing body of research that merges structural inequities with school choice and education policy with other sectors. So to look at things like transportation and how that intersects with housing segregation, with wealth gaps, connecting things like housing and gentrification to school choice, for example. But despite all the talk about interdisciplinary and mixed methods work, and some real progress in the past decade, we could really do more. I think as I've learned firsthand, it's really hard work to do this type of multidisciplinary work, and takes just, even as a first step, just reading and citing across fields and methodologies, which we don't do enough of, and bringing together, people from very different fields and social sciences. There's just a lot of different assumptions that have to be examined, a lot of different jargon, different epistemologies, different interests. So these can be really difficult conversations, but they're, I think they're just really important if we want to leverage this richness of our field toward improving education policy and practice in impactful and equitable ways. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. And as I mentioned, I had a chance to skim some of the papers that are part of these working groups. I see a lot of potential connections. So I look forward to hearing kind of what resonated with you and the work that you're doing, as well as any questions or comments you have.
Thanks, Huriya, for your presentation, for keeping in time, and also because it has been very, very interesting. We remember that we are going to have first a question from the audience. We are going to have a kind of 2 or 3 rows in 2 or 3 questions for each round. And then after, we encourage the online audience to put their questions to the chat, and we are going through them. So maybe if you have a question also, it would be particularly interesting if you introduce yourself, your affiliation, etc., etc. And Julia is going to help us in this endeavor. So, thank you, Julia. So I don't know, some questions now?
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Adrian Tangajo from the University of Manchester. So thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the inspiring work all of this year. So my question is about one of your next research lines, or the research lines that you are developing now. So it's about the regulation of the education market. And I was wondering, I know this is a work in progress, but we have been working on the regulation also of the education market with Tony, Clara from the Ville, and Xavier. And I have one question that's based on your experience and the critical work that you have done all of these years. I think that the regulation, or my hypothesis, that the regulation can make the market more fair, maybe privatization. But I was wondering about if regulation and policy designs can overcome the mechanisms that explain inequality in education markets and policy designs. I think that the case of Chile shows this very well. So now the system of admission, the system of school choice is more fair. There are no selection and so on, but you cannot change the preference of different social groups through regulation and through policy design. So my question was, in the context of the US and so on, do you see any difference with charter schools on the capacity of these policy designs to overcome the mechanisms?
That's a great question. Oh, sorry, did you want me to respond now or to wait?
No, we wait. There's a couple of people more. Julia, there, and Xavi. So thanks, Julia.
I have a question. I just want to pick up on a comment. Oh, sorry, Jane Gingrich from the University of Oxford. I want to pick up on a comment you made in the middle about the sort of changed role of local governments, and sort of one question I have is whether and how you perceive the capacity of local governments to actually regulate local markets. Because the movement from introducing these things can often either lead local governments to sort of hollow out their internal capacity to regulate, or you're asking people in them to switch from sort of managing a system that they know to one in which actually they're really at a sort of in an asymmetric position vis-a-vis the new entrants in terms of management. And so have you seen successful or varied models in terms of actually building state capacity on the management side?
Hi, Xavier Bonal from the UAB. Thank you, Huriya, for your talk and for the recent work that we have been able to read and to enjoy. I want to comment on this idea about the need of interdisciplinary work. You have written about what could bring behavioral economics in this type of landscape, and I think it's clearly suggesting in terms of surpassing a little bit the mainstream economics that we've been colonized. But what do you think in terms of the possibility market and choice analysis of this behavioral approach, and whether we might even run the risk of being colonized, as Ben Fine was saying in the early 2000s about that, when be careful when economics starts being interested in other fields, because then you are really colonized by economics. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe Huriya, if you want to tackle these questions.
Yes, such great questions. So I think with the first question about, broader inequities and what education reforms can do, even reforms that are really focused on improving access and equity in school choice, for example, I think what I've seen really resonates with what you have found, that we do see benefits of revising these policies when there is a specific focus on equity. So for example, in New Orleans, there used to be no centralized enrollment system. So individual families had to navigate go to every single school, fill out paper applications, things like that. And that was streamlined into a centralized enrollment system, that took away some of the autonomies that individual schools had in terms of managing their enrollment, but made the system more fair for families. I think though that, while I think we see those benefits within the educational system, similar to the work that I mentioned on competition and its effects, they're small and positive, but just, are not big enough to really undo these broader systemic inequities. And that's where I think the work that is really trying to align more with, in the US, the broader systemic inequities often have to do with housing, transportation, income, right? So how can we think about education in conjunction with those? And there's been so much focus in the US on just education policy with and ignoring these other policy sectors that are so critical. And I think the tension for me is often, I kind of alluded to this, but how much of our time and work do we spend, tinkering with these choice systems and making them a little bit more equitable and accessible versus, focusing on these kind of cross-sector approaches. But I think, we can do both. There are, children in schools, as I mentioned right now, in these choice systems and ways to make those systems better. But the real work, I think, is in these broader cross-sector approaches. In terms of capacity and local government, I think that's just such an interesting question. And the place that I've seen that, is in New Orleans, where initially the state kind of took over these schools and really didn't have the capacity to run them, didn't want to run schools. They said, we're not in the business of running schools, we're handing them over to private operators. But there was a lot of concern and critique about the lack of oversight. And so in recent years, they've returned those schools to local control. So it's a locally elected school board, but it's really been hollowed out. There's, because all of the schools are charter schools, they're just not, they've had to figure out what staff do we really need in the district, what needs to be kind of managed and overseen at a centralized level. And I think with COVID especially, that really brought to light how sometimes having certain things centralized and taking away autonomies from individual schools really helped to navigate a crisis. So for example, districts, traditional school districts typically have stronger relationships with public health sectors because they coordinate on other things, like generally vaccines, not just COVID vaccines and things like that. And so it's easier for them to coordinate a response to a public health crisis than for these individual charter schools to manage their own. And they actually, in this case, willingly ceded some of their autonomies because they knew they didn't have the capacity to really respond to the crisis at this scale. But I think there are, I think some of the specific things that they've done are, school board trainings for the charter school boards, which are private, right? They're to help them, think about governance, and really the state has focused on transparency in that governance process there. But I think it's a challenge, right? It's, what is the role of a district that is only overseeing charter schools versus one that is directly providing educational services? I don't think that's been quite figured out in any of the contexts I've studied. And then, the behavioral economics idea, it's what I think just to be honest, like in my whole career, I've really been just so curious about this role of economists in education. I think initially I thought, well, here's an approach that's at least drawing on other disciplines and what we know from other disciplines like psychology to inform our understanding of how people make decisions in education contexts. And increasingly I've found other approaches that I think do these more heterodox approaches in economics that I think can actually get at the structural inequities. Because I think my concern with the behavioral approach is that it's still very much rooted in the individual and kind of ignores some of these other social and systemic factors. But again, I do think that if we're talking about kind of tinkering with market-based policies in ways that can improve equity, I do think that behavioral economics at least attends to things like the nudge and the sludge, right? The administrative burdens that are inherent in these systems, and how can we at least streamline them and make school choice more accessible and easier to navigate, for example. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Huriya. We try another round within the audience. We have a question here and then there.
Thank you, Felicitas Acosta from Argentina. Thank you for your presentation. At the end of the presentation, you mentioned that you were working on other ideas that are play on decision making. So first, I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how does, for example, institutional prestige plays out around school choice. And the other question is, even in systems where there is no school choice, schools always find a way to select students. So what does your empiric work tell about how to regulate this? Because I would say that in the end, when talking about school choice, the question is, who chooses whom? Is it the school or is it the families? So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
From Northwest University. I want to refer back to the tension between parents and the state with respect to who has the final say on what education should be and how it should be done. I think there's a fair bit of alignment between parent boards and the kind of control they exercise in the local school board decisions. So I think in that sense, like the government and the parent associations really overlap as well. And in the context of crisis, would it be like the Black Lives Matter movement or the COVID crisis after that, where there has been a lot of shift to private schools? So how do those like relationships between like aggregates of parents have implications for this targeted competitive marketing that you referred? not only in terms of like attracting students, but also in terms of like the teacher recruitment practices.
Hi, my name is Gulrin. I'm a PhD student at Miami University. I want to know would you like to unpack the role of Teach for America, like these kind of actors, especially they focus on underserved areas. I think there's similar campaign in other countries, like I'm from Pakistan. We have a Teach for Pakistan, also some other names. So what do you think? They said we are selecting brightest graduates from top end universities and they really serve.
Yeah, there's another one. We are having maybe.
Hello, I'm Emily Winship from Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. You mentioned at the beginning the talk of the goal of these kind of school choice policies. And after the first keynote that we discussed about how those goals aren't always set ahead of time, where we go back and redefine what those goals are. Just curious what you have to say about equity in that and how that has the goal of equity and school choice and how that maybe has changed or been replaced by other goals.
So yes, Huriya.
Great. Gosh, such good questions. I wish I was there with you all so we could talk more about this. So the first question was about the role of kind of institutional prestige and choice, and I think so. You know, in the work that I was doing on like how school leaders perceive competition, I do think that there was this kind of prestige associated with these like quote unquote brand name charters that went, you know, above and beyond their actual school performance, so school leaders were perceiving them as competitors, even if they weren't higher performing, even if they weren't close by. And so I think there's just this kind of, you know, idea of prestige that played out in that sense. And these were kind of these chain charter networks. There was also, though, these long-standing kind of patterns of prestige in both New Orleans and Detroit, just places, these more elite public schools that had selective enrollment, you know, application exam schools. And those just have held on to this prestige despite, and I guess, you know, this restricted access, despite many attempts to try to make, you know, them more accessible. We are seeing this debate right now across the U.S. though, and it started because of COVID, where a lot of these you know, selective enrollment, very prestigious, mostly high schools, are now, I think because of COVID, temporarily changed their policy to be just an open kind of a lottery system, but with the goal also of making them more equitable. Since then, though, there's been a lot of pushback. And so I think it's just a very contentious issue right now, which is, you know, should these prestigious institutions be able to select students, and what does that mean for equity? And in terms of schools choosing students, yes, I mean, I think, you know, even in traditional public schools, there's some, you know, some forms of selection. I think where we see a stark difference is really around special education services, and just talking to families that are trying to navigate all charter systems with students who have disabilities. It's just very challenging. And, you know, in part because charter schools don't always have the capacity to provide those services. You know, I think, you know, talking to school leaders, I understand that, but it is, you know, legally required. And so I think that is where even, and, you know, parents of children with disabilities have trouble navigating the traditional public school system as well to ensure that their children get the services that they need. But it just seems so much more stark in the charter sector. In terms of strategies to improve that or to, you know, address school selection, as I mentioned, in New Orleans, there was this shift to centralized enrollment where at least schools could no longer manage their own lotteries, which, you know, could be first come, first served, could have, you know, they could have gone back to the lottery to fill in slots that opened up mid-year or not. And so, you know, I mentioned this really gets into the nitty-gritty of these policies where now the concern in New Orleans is around the paperwork required. So sure, the district manages enrollment, so schools can't select students, at the outset, but they can choose what paperwork is required. And so that's a way of, creating an additional barrier of, and then is the paperwork, can it be done online? Does it have to be brought in person? And if a family doesn't have a car, so there are just all these levels. And I think those happen in traditional public school systems as well. And in terms of addressing it, I think part of it is these, tweaks to application systems. I think the other challenge that I mentioned earlier is like the reason schools are doing this is because of these competing pressures, right, of market-based pressure and school performance or accountability pressures. If they, in some places in the US where people are starting to kind of rethink assessment and accountability, and I think they have been in an ongoing way, but especially because of COVID, I think, in the temporary pause in testing has forced people to rethink that. Which hopefully will, relates to a broader rethinking of kind of the goals of public education. But I just don't see us really moving away from the selection. Like schools will find some way to do it if they have this pressure of meeting, accountability pressures. What schools leaders said to me was, they were so committed. They started charter schools because they wanted to serve marginalized students, but at the same time, their school would get closed down if they didn't, meet certain testing requirements. And so they just have this tension. And I don't put the blame on the individual leaders. I think it's a systemic issue. It's the system of incentives and the structures that school leaders are working in and trying to, in most cases, do their best. I think the question about parent associations and, what is happening as parents choose and leave. I didn't hear the first part. I think the audio didn't come through, but I think the question around like, are parents jumping ship to private schools, whether, due to these different crises and the implications. I think we're trying to study this right now. We're as part of this center, we obviously had to pivot like many others to focus on COVID. But it wasn't just COVID. So initially, I think we expected to see parents moving schools a lot more, maybe because they wanted a school that taught in person versus virtual, but we actually didn't see a lot of movement in our sample. We did surveys of parents across 5 states and also some qualitative interviews. And really the uncertainty in the environment just caused parents to kind of stick with what they knew. They didn't really want to make that kind of shift during this really uncertain time. To a new school that they may, where it'd be even harder to navigate during with the virtual learning and things like that. What we are seeing though is with policymakers and especially conservative policymakers are really seizing this kind of backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement and talking about race and schools to push through policies that I think more than ever before really explicitly say, you can leave, here's a voucher or here's go to this charter school where you can avoid, learning about race and racism, and really just kind of picking up on this whole anti-CRT movement in the US and the kind of fear that especially white families have around how race is being taught. I think it's yet to be seen whether that will actually lead to huge shifts in enrollment. But I'll be curious to see kind of how that plays out first, whether these bills are even successful, and then at the, in the legislature, and then what happens as a result. The question about Teach for America, I think there's just Teach for America is such an interesting organization, over time, I think just how it's evolved. In the US now, teachers, Teach for America says that its main mission is not necessarily to fill teacher shortages, which is what it initially set out to do in these, high need, underserved areas. And I think that's what it, claims to do nationally too, right? I think it also, of course, was based on these really elitist assumptions about, who makes a good teacher, coming from these very elite institutions, versus I think there's another kind of movement, which is around kind of grow your own teacher programs, which is trying to train teachers who are from the communities that these schools are based in. But I think over time, TFA has shifted to really seeing itself, or, as an organization that gives people this experience, and then they go off into hopefully education policy. But even if they don't, they've argued, that experience will stick with people even if they go into, management and consulting and things like that. So I just think it's interesting also just how this organization has kind of shifted over time. And what I found really surprising was that in Detroit, where there was a huge teacher shortage, like 200 unfilled positions at the start of the year, and just generally it was well known that there was a real shortage of teachers in the city. Teach for America was actually scaling back its program there, and was, I think, the other program that was similar was closing down. And so I think just the tension between that idea that, they're coming to fill this critical need, and then kind of scaling back in the places that have a really critical need, I think it's just interesting. And so I'd be curious how Teach for Pakistan or other Teach for All type programs think about their role, and whether they also are shifting to this kind of longer term strategy, or if it really is around filling shortages. In terms of goals, shifting goals, right? Policies also do that, right? And one thing we found in our, with this, it's in progress right now, but in our work on what's the rationale for these policies, school choice policies, is that I think basically our argument is that it's all things to all people. So there's a rationale and they're simultaneous, right? Around equality of schools, around equity, around liberty or freedom and choice, efficiency or innovation, right? These are all these ideas that are used at varying times to promote these policies. And I think where it matters is how, which of those win out in the policy design, right? How are these ideas then brought into the specific ways in which choice policies are designed, and how those different levers, how if equity is used as a rationale, as a goal, how does that actually play out in terms of enrollment policies, transportation policies related to school choice? But I think our work, this was a couple of years ago that we stopped collecting the data, and we're hoping to do more data collection, because initially we had this all things to all people idea, but and also the liberty framing of choice was really not as popular across the US state context. It sort of initially had been, this market idea of just the idea of choice in and of itself is important. So we sort of moved away from that with more of an equity framing, at least, right? But we're now again seeing this liberty framing come back with these new voucher bills. Again, these goals change, and I think which goal is prominent changes, depending on the particular moment.
We have Laura question in the chat. I don't know if somebody else has, because this is going to be the last opportunity for asking something to Huriya now. I have a very small question also. Huriya, your work on perception on competition has been fundamental for the reform project in terms of conceptualizing the idea of a structural objective competition, but also how this is in local education market perceived, and how this can lead to some undesired effects. Nevertheless, I'm very curious to know if you have in the guide the combination of two different sources of pressure for school principals, which are accountability pressures and market-based pressures in a context such as New Orleans, where charter schools are predominant. Particularly, I'm very curious in understand whether both pressures tend to combine, intensify, mitigate themselves, or if somehow principals distinguish among them. In this sense, I think that the work on Every Kid is Money, you talk a little bit about that, but I'm always wondering if there is something more that you have there. In parallel, we have the Laura Engel question about marketing branding in charter schools. So maybe we have these two final questions, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so Huriya.
Yeah, I think yeah, they're very related, right? The differentiation and marketing. I'm trying to remember, we did have a finding in New Orleans from this work. So I can't remember exactly the extent to which we found evidence of this differentiation, but yes, I mean, the differentiation is different than the kind of competition that's typically envisioned, right? Which is just improving quality, right? The core quality, rather than, adding on, we are a STEM school or we're an arts integrated school. And one, I think, open question is just the extent to which these, so obviously the goal of choice is to provide these different types of learning experiences, right? That might meet the needs of different children and their interests. But at least in New Orleans and in many other places too, where we've seen lots of charter schools, there isn't a lot of variation in the types of schools. So there seems to be kind of differentiation in terms of marketing, but in terms of the actual practices, everyday practices, there's not a lot. So I think just that we need a lot more research on to what extent, does this marketing align with variation in practice? If you're an arts integrated school, what does that mean in terms of the actual practices inside of the school? Or is it really just a way to differentiate yourself from the competition? I think the thing about differentiation, though, is that it doesn't address the accountability pressures, right? The test-based pressure. So I think one of the reasons we, others have studied this and made this point, that perhaps one of the reasons that we don't see this kind of innovation that we had anticipated in the charter market is because of the simultaneous rise of accountability policy, as well as school choice in the U.S., where there was, too much of a risk and uncertainty in really adopting innovative practices, because that may, that might not meet the state test score requirements and could ultimately lead to school closures. I do think one source of variation that it would be important to look at, and I don't think has been really examined, is to what extent are schools actually being closed for these different reasons. So New Orleans was very strict and really did shut down schools for performance-based reasons consistently. And so I think the fear of closure was a very real one there. In other places that doesn't always happen. And so I think looking at how principals feel these pressures differently based on the not just the policy design, but also the actual policy actions and enforcement of that policy would be important. I'm just looking over Laura's question to see if there's anything else. Yeah, I don't know if this mission. So I guess two thoughts on the like changes in mission. Also, one thing my colleagues and I have thought about is, I think there's grade level differences for this too. If you're in elementary school, if you're choosing an elementary school for your child, you may have your own preferences for your child's education, but in some of the early work we've done, it does seem like that decision-making process is very different than that for a high school student or, for secondary school, because at that point, the child actually plays a bigger role in the choice and actually has, maybe specific interests and hobbies and skills and, interest in music or sports, that kind of thing that could shape that decision. It's unclear how much differentiation we would or people would want at the elementary school level, where you might just want kind of a general education and expose your child to lots of different things because they haven't fully formed their personality and their specialization yet. And so I think just looking at some of the differences in marketing and also the prevalence of like these STEM schools and across grade levels is also an important area to explore. But, my sense is that a lot of schools have branded themselves in particular ways, but like I said, it's unclear like how much actual practice is aligned to that branding. I'll give one example, just really quick about that. When I started doing field work in New Orleans, almost every school with charter schools, a no excuses charter school. That has fallen out of favor. And so because of, critiques of that discipline policy, now everyone uses, restorative justice approaches and, that on paper, but again, you go into the schools and they feel the same. And so it's unclear, how much, what does that mean in the actual practice of schools?
So thank you, Huriya, for engaging in this dialogue. We are without more questions, so we can go to a coffee break. We have half an hour. So thanks again. Thanks again for the presentation. And,
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your conference.